Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be continuing our worst map ever series by looking at Advance to the Rhine. Now, Advance to the Rhine is definitely on the older end for War Thunder maps. It dates all the way back about 10 years to 2015, and it did get a recent rework, although the rework, to be honest, was mostly cosmetic and visual changes and didn't really adjust map flow. There is, however, another interesting piece of trivia with Advance to the Rhine and at least one other map wherein earlier on with Advance to the Rhine, there were actually destroyed Panther tanks littering a lot of the map. The problem with these destroyed Panther tanks, and the reason why they were ultimately replaced with rubble piles, is that the Panther tanks didn't actually react like a normal destroyed vehicle, especially as the game got a little bit more complex and mechanics for towing and shooting through other vehicles eventually came to the fore. Because ultimately these were map objects, they weren't actually vehicles, so you couldn't tow them and you couldn't shoot through them like you could an actual Panther corpse. So unless you just instinctively knew which of the destroyed Panthers were map objects and which ones were actual dead enemies that you could potentially interact with, you would run into some scenarios where your shot would inadvertently get eaten. And that's part of the reason in terms of mechanical consistency as to why these ultimately got replaced with various rubble piles. Now, Advance to the Rhine currently has 6 permutations instead of the normal 5, and the reason for this is while you do have a normal 3 cap and a normal 2 cap, you actually have 4 different single caps. One of them basically adds an entirely new capture point that isn't on any other version of the map. So that's why this does have one extra variant, because it's using that essentially bonus capture point. There are currently no versions of Advance to the Rhine in the matchmaker that noticeably increase or reduce the play space, so you are effectively working within the same arena with each map. However, some of the permutations do use slightly adjusted vehicle spawns, but we'll go into those as we get to them. And starting out as we normally do with these map reviews, let's look at the capture points. The A capture point is actually fairly infamous in that it is an absolute bloodbath. It is directly in between 2 of the major spawn locations, and these are also the default spawn locations that you will often get if you don't specifically select one. So a lot of the players that basically just spawn in and hold W will go towards A. That being said, while there are a lot of routes into A, there is also a fair bit of cover on A, so it's not the worst location that we've ever seen in terms of this series, in terms of getting onto A and capturing the point, and then also getting off and finding somewhere useful to go. A does form a bit of a hub because there are 2 basically straight lines going to B and C from A, so you can control a decent amount of the map. However, the constant enemy respawns will basically limit what you can effectively do on that point. For the B cap and the C cap, at least in the normal 3 cap version, I'm actually going to do something different and cover them both at the same time because they are very similar capture points. There's basically no real cover on either of these capture points, however they are slightly obscured from each other because, as you can see, there is a bend in this little road going between them, so they can't necessarily see each other directly, although they can see parts of each other, and the only real cover on the points themselves are essentially burnt out trolleys that can't really stop incoming shells, especially high penetration kinetic shells. Both of the points do have relatively easy routes to get onto them and to get off of them quickly, although the lack of cover might actually necessitate a lot more smoke usage to take these points than it would be for a normal point, because there are simply way too many angles in which you can be shot from. So this is one of the few scenarios where I might actually recommend smoking, especially if you're capturing it at the beginning of the map where there might be some enemies watching the cross between these points. Of course, this brings us to the, we'll call it the D point because it is essentially the hidden 4th cap that is essentially in the middle of this little park. Now, the problem with the D point, as we'll call it, is essentially that the park doesn't provide a ton of real cover. It's basically a bunch of undulating hills, so if somebody does have good gun depression or their vehicle is tall enough, they can often just see over these obstacles. On top of that, because all of the paths into and out of the park are fairly shallow, there are a lot of angles that can look in and see into this middle section of the park. So while it's not that difficult to get onto it, successfully taking the capture point and getting off of it might be a bit of a challenge. Now, as with all of these reviews, I'm going to briefly go into my thoughts on the 2 cap version of the map, and my immediate thought is just don't. As I just discussed, there is essentially no cover on either of these points. They're easily flanked and shot by a multitude of different angles. Also, they're going to be spammed by artillery. The only real cover there is trolleys, etc., etc. You're also right next to the enemy spawn. These are incredible incredibly difficult to capture unless you've already basically stuffed the enemy into their spawn and they can't move, and in that scenario you are probably going to win anyway, so I definitely wouldn't go for these unless you've basically already won. Now this is normally the part where I'd cover movement lanes, except Advance to the Rhine is actually very weird in this area because it turns out Advance to the Rhine has pretty different movement lanes depending on which permutation of the map you're playing, despite the fact that all of the maps are identical. And this comes down to the fact that the game turns on and off certain spawns depending on which version you're playing on. For the 3-cap map, which is what we're going to be looking at first, you have two essentially major movement lanes. You have the movement lane that basically goes from either left-hand spawn into A, and then you have the other movement lane that goes from either right-hand spawn through C and B. There's also a pseudo movement lane that goes from either right-hand spawn into A, and this is one of the less traveled, but it is still a fairly common lane. This also raises an interesting point because typically when we talk about main movement lanes, these are separate and distinct from flanks. However, because this map is so close quarters, a lot of these main movement lanes bring you very close to the full left and right hand side of the map. So the only flanking opportunities on Advance to the Rhine are actually relatively shallow ones, or alternatively, this park area in the middle of the map that we talked about for the D point also provides a decent flanking opportunity, which is somewhat paradoxical because it is basically in the middle of the map, but it's also not as common of an avenue for people to go to because it's not directly going to any capture point from any spawn. This ironically means that if you want to flank and get side shots on enemies, often the best solution is to go essentially straight up the middle of the map. Alternatively, you do of course have these little side streets to the left hand side of A and to the right hand side of the BC corridor. These are fairly common though, especially because the spawns are pretty close to them and because they are so accessible from B and C. Additionally, this map also creates a rather weird paradigm in that because the 3 points form a triangle and there is a direct road going between them, you actually get movement lanes going between the points pretty common as well, especially if you get later in the map. So that is something to be on the lookout for, especially if you are trying to flank the enemy, is that it is very common, especially later in the map, for enemies to be going between any of these individual points. So this triangle can also kind of devolve into a major movement lane in and of itself. The next major spawn orientation that I want to look at is the movement lane in which you only have the right hand side spawns. In this formation, you actually get some relatively unusual movement lanes in that the two major movement lanes are the ones going between the spawns themselves and then also going to the right hand side between the capture points. This also means you have a lot of heavy activity around this little park area in the middle, a lot more so than normal. However, the left-hand side of the map, the part that is normally a bloodbath when you have the 3 capture map, is actually pretty quiet when you have this configuration. So if you do see one of these types of configurations for this map, the left-hand side often makes for a very excellent flanking opportunity that is severely underutilized in my opinion. Now the next orientation I want to look at is the one where one side only has the left-hand spawn and the other side only has the right-hand spawn. This is actually a rather interesting orientation because no matter which side has which spawn, the major movement avenues are going straight through the monument or alternatively going straight through the point. This is pretty interesting for two reasons. Number one, the left-hand side that is normally a bloodbath actually gets given to whichever team can spawn to it closest, because you can take control of it very quickly and you get some excellent flanking opportunities to the monument. The other interesting change is that the right-hand lane that is usually pretty heavily contested by both teams, the spawn that gets on the right-hand side has access to it a lot faster and controls it a lot easier. So it's important to remember that this does somewhat change up the flanking routes and opportunities, and you should be aware of this. Now, this naturally leads into a discussion about the various power positions, and this is where there's a bit of an asterisk because how useful any individual power position is on this particular map is actually pretty dependent on the spawn orientation, so you should definitely be keeping that in mind. Obviously, a position will be less useful if the enemy is not going towards it all that often. And I think the first point of discussion to get out of the way is that while the A capture point does have a lot of cover, I wouldn't exactly regard it as a power position because A is very exposed from a lot of different angles. So unless your team is exercising some pretty thorough map control, A is actually very easy to contest. It's very easy for for the enemy to get into a position that you won't necessarily have any kind of hard cover against. For that reason, I would highly recommend, if you are on the A point, to capture it and then move out to stronger positions as quickly as possible, unless of course your team is securing enough of the area that you can be confident that you won't necessarily get flanked. The first set of power positions on the left-hand side are a series of rubble piles here, 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 and here. These are essentially 2 rubble piles per side that can be used to overwatch these alleyways. The reason why these are power positions, even though the enemy can see you, is that obviously you can simply use the third-person camera to peek around them, but more importantly, because they are rubble piles with a nice slope to them, you can use them to hide your lower hull and also retreat quickly if you get something like a barrel shot. They also control access to the A point, so they are obviously worth controlling if for no other reason than to control the A point. The next set of power positions that's actually worth pointing out, because you can make a general nuisance of yourself if you get to these positions, are the row of buildings immediately to the left of B and immediately to the left of C. These buildings provide excellent vision and a lot of opportunities to poke around a corner and get opportunistic shots on opponents. It's also somewhat difficult to contest you, although the problem with these points is that because there are so many gaps in the building, while it does make it easy to sneak up and get shots on people, it also makes it pretty easy to not see somebody and have them get a shot on you. So while these are excellent positions that can really lock down one side of the map, they do require a pretty significant amount of awareness to really make work effectively. The last kind of major set of power positions are actually on the far right hand side, essentially at the top and bottom. Yet again, you have some nice rubble piles that you can use to hide parts of your hull and also retreat behind if you get shot in the barrel, and covering this entire lane in the time frame that it takes to repair a barrel at lower battle ratings basically doesn't happen, and even at higher battle ratings, as long as you have at least one teammate to help you, you can usually get your barrel up and running before the enemy covers this distance. So in general, it is a good way to lock this part of the map down, even if you aren't actively making progress on it. So now we're going into tips and tricks on Advance to the Rhine, and one thing that I will say right now is because some of these variants play pretty differently, I am going to split this up a little. On the configuration similar to the 3-cap, the only reason to really go on the left-hand side of the map is if you have a vehicle that you feel can really brawl efficiently, or if you have a vehicle that's fast enough to get to some of the power positions on rubble pile or A before the enemy can really get set up. In those instances, you can actually have a lot of success. However, for a lot of vehicles, it is simply a bloodbath. There's going to be a constant stream of enemy reinforcements, and ultimately you will generally get overwhelmed. So the left-hand side of the map, while a lot of people do like to go there, and it is basically the default spawn, is often not your best choice if you want to have a good game. Starting at the right-hand spawn, regardless of whether your intent is to go to the far right, go to the zones, or alternatively just try to go up the middle for a flank, can usually net you better games. With that being said, I don't feel like going to the left-hand side is a completely terrible idea, especially if you are trying to grind your way up a tech tree pretty quickly. Win, lose, or draw, the game will be over pretty fast if you go in that part of the map, and it does provide you with a lot more opportunities to get kills if you are paying attention and if you can land your shots. So if you are looking for a much faster paced and bloodier type of game, going on the left-hand side and basically getting the shipment from Call of Duty experience, it's not the worst idea in the world, although generally speaking it doesn't produce consistent results in my opinion. Whenever I get a map that has the 2 right-hand spawns, however, I do tend to heavily favor going to the left. While the left-hand side is an absolute bloodbath in the more normal configurations, when people are spawning on the right, you tend to only be contested by a handful of opponents, and they aren't getting constant reinforcements. On top of that, you can lock down a lot of the map basically by controlling the monuments and the area to the immediate left of the monument, so this is a pretty good position to consistently get kills and keep a nice flanking position over for your opponents, while also keeping your opponents from flanking your own team. That's not to say I always avoid the right-hand side of the map, but I do generally find I can get better games on the left-hand side of the map in this particular configuration. In the single cap A variant, the area going directly between both spawns ends up being a complete bloodbath, and A itself is pretty messy. However, the far left left-hand flank is usually a lot more sparsely populated than normal, obviously because people aren't simply spawning there all the time. That being said, the right-hand side of the map on this configuration is almost completely empty, so if you want to go for a hard flank, you can usually pull it off. That being said, you do run the risk of having to basically go all the way across the enemy spawn in order to actually start getting kills, because there's going to be so little activity on that side of the map very often. So while the right-hand side of the map can get you some cheeky flanking positions, it also runs the risk of being a little too useless, and I generally prefer sticking to the far left-hand flank or fighting around A. For the two more asymmetric configurations, my general preference is basically to go anywhere but the monument. This is one of those unique ones where the monument is a complete bloodbath, but most of the rest of the map is actually pretty sparsely populated, so you can go towards long flanks to the right or long flanks towards the left without any real difficulty, usually only finding one or two opponents. The straight line through monument, however, is a complete mess, so unless you're playing something like a mouse where you think you can take all of that punishment, usually not that advisable. This is also one of those where it's usually not that bad to go to the capture point. However, the capture points can be observed from monument, so you can run a pretty significant risk of simply getting sniped from the giant bloodbath going on in the middle of the map. On the whole, I feel like going to the far left and right are both pretty viable strategies here. It's just going directly to point and going up the middle are the only two that don't really work. In that respect, these configurations end up almost working like a normal map, where flanking to the left or the right is actually how you flank, whereas going directly towards the point or towards the enemy spawn is really just where you go to bash your brains against the enemy. As far as my personal thoughts on Advance of the Rhine, I would say on the whole I don't really love it or hate it. For me personally, it's just kind of another map. The absolute furball that takes place around Monument is amusing, especially if you have a vehicle that can take advantage of it, although it is a little handy that most of the other parts of the map tend to be a lot less heavily populated, and thus you do have some pretty decent flanking opportunities. That being said, it doesn't have a lot of really long sight lines or vision lines, and most of the ones that it does have are incredibly restrictive, so if you do have a vehicle that doesn't exactly have great armor or doesn't exactly want to be near the enemy, it can be a very restrictive map to play on. Vehicles like some of the tank destroyers at lower battle rating that have relatively thin armor and either don't have a turret or have very slow turret traverse are not a huge fan of this map. There simply aren't a ton of places to set up, and all of the places you can set up can be easily countered or flanked pretty comfortably. I would also say a minor sense of annoyance is that I do actually like light vehicles that can sneak into awkward spots and get a good rotation, and Advance the Rhine just doesn't quite have the restrictive line of sight that you would really want to. Ironically, despite the fact that people think of this as a pretty dense urban map, there are a lot of random lines of sight around the middle of the map near the park and the other areas where enemies can just randomly snipe you from remarkably long distances. This does mean that you have to be exceedingly careful if you're playing a light tank on this map, whereas some of the other urban maps have large complete buildings to block line of sight instead of just piles of rubble, so you can pretty much guarantee that the enemy doesn't see you until you get that effective flank off. In that respect, this isn't as good for light tanks as a lot of the other urban maps, simply because you don't have as many opportunities to find those rotations. You have to play a lot more ratty than normal if you're in a lightly armored vehicle. Heavily armored vehicles tend to really like Advance of the Rhine though, simply because there are so many opportunities to use your armor effectively around corners and around rubble piles. Ultimately, I think my ambivalence towards this map is that it reminds me very much of Shoot House from Call of Duty, if you're familiar with that map. Shoot House is not quite as small or restrictive as maps like Nuketown or Shipment, but it is a relatively small map with fairly confined and very curated engagement types. And it does make the map fun to play in short doses, but fairly annoying if you get it multiple times in a row. And for me, that kind of is Advance of the Rhine. If I just want to turn my brain off and see how many kills I can rack up, I go to the left-hand side of the map and see if I can get lucky. If I want to be a little more thoughtful, I go to the right-hand side of the map, see if I can find some more interesting rotations and flanks. But ultimately, I do feel like the fact that so much of the middle of the map is rubble that the enemy can and definitely will shoot through does make the map more restrictive and more open than it necessarily seems on the surface, which doesn't give quite as much of that close-in urban experience as I would really like. And it also can lead to some pretty frustrating deaths when somebody narrowly sees your turret or your engine through a window. Like I said, I don't love it, I don't hate it. I don't think it's a bad map, but it doesn't really stand out in my mind as something something that I'm eager to play on. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know what you think about Advance to the Rhine in comments down below. Do you love it? Do you hate it? What are your favorite strategies? I always love to hear from you guys. If you enjoyed the video, you found it helpful, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.